So I want to just make a few key points about what the peer-to-peer revolution means in economic terms and in terms of governance. So the first thing I'd like to say is that if you agree with me that we're entering an era where access to energy and raw materials is becoming a bit more problematic than before, then it's interesting to see that when these things happen in history, that societies move from economies of scale to economies of scope, which essentially means doing more with the same thing. And so one of the aspects of the peer-to-peer revolution is exactly that. We have a mutualization of knowledge through open source, so it means doing more with the same knowledge. And then we have more and more mutualization of infrastructures. Think about collaborative consumption. Simply by applying car sharing, you use 80% less raw materials and energy for the same amount of transportation. So these things there's a reason that these things are happening, and which is that people are also looking for more sustainable solutions. The second keyword that I would like to impart is, the key notion of distribution, right? Distribution in the sense of distributions of the means of production. So we are entering an era where instead of needing centralized resources or even decentralized resources, we are going towards distributed resources, meaning that people can allocate more minute forms of capital. And this is true both for finance, think about crowdfunding, social lending, think about emerging peer-to-peer currencies, but also think about machinery, think about 3D printing. And this is not just thinking in terms of, kind of this vision that everybody at home has a machine. I don't think this is why it's interesting. I think it's interesting because it gives us a vision of networked microfactories, which have a level of specialization and can make more and more things locally. And of course, it makes sense that things that require heavy transportation should be done more locally, and things which require, let's say, more immaterial aspects can be done on a global basis. So there's a certain kind of reorganization of production going on in that sense, in the sense that the heavy becomes more local and the light becomes more global. Just to give you an example, I'm sure you're all aware of Wikispeed, the open source car. What's interesting about this project is that the speed at which they can innovate, right? They produce a new car every week. So when I say a new car, it's not just a new car, just the same car as before. Every car they make is different from the one they make before. And they've done this by innovating, it's called extreme manufacturing. And so they're able to basically have a global development community which improves the car on a weekly basis, and they crash test everything before they put it in the car. So these are extremely rapid innovation methods that are very interesting to learn from and to infuse, the productive system with. What I would like to say is that the capacity for innovation has tremendously increased. Now, I'm not an expert in this, but one of the things I follow is, the urban farming revolution. And the amount of innovation that is happening by communities on a global basis, sharing agricultural innovations in their machinery, in the way they treat the soil, is quite remarkable. So that means that a lot of traditional techniques that we thought of as regressive as compared to the industrial system are becoming much more productive than before. So I think it's really vital that we start looking at this bottom-up innovation, that we have to look not just at private innovation, corporate innovation, but we have to look more and more at what's happening in terms of civic innovation. And this is not just technological innovation, it's also social innovation. It's inventions in terms of ownership, inventions in terms of governance that are really, really interesting. Now, one of the things that I would like to impart, because I think there's quite a few people from public authorities in the room. Maybe you're not aware of this, but for every % growth in GDP in Brazil, there's a 4 times bigger reduction in poverty than in India. So what this means is that this doesn't come from the GDP, this comes from the public policies, right? And a country like Brazil has a whole set of enabling policies that support this innovation, not just politically through participatory budgeting and participatory legislation, but for example, they have a law on the solidarity economy. They have a law on local currencies, which are directly supported by the Central Bank of Brazil. They have created 5,000 centers of digital production in the favelas and in the rural areas, which has created a whole culture of cooperation amongst youth. I guess, you know, because I was told to be short, so these are a few of the things I would like to say, but maybe there's a question in the room and I can respond to the question. Yes. I'm listening. Yes. I think so. You know, I mean, the notion of Jeremy Rifkin about the third industrial revolution makes a lot of sense to me, because it's really it's based on the idea of distribution, right? So you have an internet of knowledge, you have an internet of energy, and you have an internet of production. And this is what we have to look at. It's, for example, if you look at the energy production in Germany, renewable energy production, so they're actually more rapidly reaching their 20% goal than they anticipated. And 50% of this achievement comes from local, distributed, citizen-driven cooperatives. So basically, quite a few of them have this this notion that so the citizen invests in the local infrastructure, and if you like, what they get for their investment is energy, right? So they're paid back in energy. So this is just an example of these social innovations that are taking place, and it makes a lot of sense to make regions more resilient in the face of global, you know, dislocation. And I think, as I understand it, the Basque Country is doing a bit better than Spain in general, but I'm sure you are very sensitive to, you know, the dislocation of the economy that is taking place. And so the idea of, you know, I'm not arguing for total localization. I think this is an illusion, but to have more resilient agricultural production, to have more resilient energy production on local level, I think is a very important thing to achieve. And then, of course, even though it's early days, I would argue that you really have to open your eyes for industrial innovation, distributed industrial innovation. And so what is happening through this open hardware fields and this experimentation with microfactories. What's interesting, of course, is that you have a local production, but you have access to global knowledge. And it's this combination which is so interesting, because, you know, we have this notion that the local is regressive. And I would say that today this is no longer the case. The local and the global is one continuum. And you can have local production that is very innovative, very adapted to the local economy and context, but at the same time, it is profiting from global innovations that are happening everywhere. I'm not sure you're aware of this, but every Friday, there is a trending topic on Twitter in the UK. And these are the farmers who are talking together and sharing their innovations every Friday. So this is not just a marginal thing, because in order to trend on Twitter, you have to have a massive communication going on. So this is just an example. Another example is something called Nutrient Dense Project, which is a global community of scientists, citizen scientists, and farmers who are sharing their innovation around how to get better stuff in the soil to get better food. And so, because they're operating on a global scale, they can compare a similar biotope in Peru and in Bhutan. And they can share their experiments and innovations on a global scale, but at the same time they apply it on the local level. So I think this is the important change that is happening. So I would argue that we need some kind of centers of excellence for monitoring these advances in productive knowledge, because we still have an issue of scaling. Well, what I mean is that there's a lot of important things happening that are substantial advances, but they're not circulating as rapidly as we would like, because they're not facilitated. And so I see a very important role for public authorities as facilitating these types of innovation. So not just facilitating private entrepreneurs, but facilitating social innovation and social production and civic innovation as well. What is, I think, important to realize is that, you take, for example, free software. So you take open knowledge, open design, and open software. And so this is called, in the United States, there's a report called the Fair Use Economy. They've calculated that the economy created by this open knowledge is now 1/6 of GDP, and it's 17 million people that are working around this. So even though at the core you may have, free contributions that are, strictly speaking, not economical, because they're not measured, because they're, these are people solving issues, contributing to the Wikipedia, contributing to geolocation services, contributing to open hardware projects. But what they do is they create, around these common pool resources, a very active economy. And I think this is paradoxically better done in the US than in Europe, right? You take the geographic information. In Europe, we think that the government should recoup the investment, and they're licensed to just a few players. So it does create an economy, but it's a relatively small economy. In the US, they liberated geolocation data, and it's creating a huge economy, not just of a few licensees, but basically a whole ecosystem of apps and local companies that are adding value on this common pool of geographic data. So that's, I think, an important thing. And maybe one more thing, which I think is the argument around the sustainability of the designs. If you design as a company, you design for scarcity, you design for market dynamics. And so you introduce planned obsolescence in your innovation process. But if you design as a community, you design directly for sustainability. So you have a combination of a community-driven innovation process that happens in a common pool with community rules and norms, and around it you have market entities. Then what you get is that the market entities work with more sustainable designs than if they would have done the design themselves.